Good evening and welcome to this installation of the Hagen History Center Spring 2021 Speaker Series. I'm Jeff Sherry, Museum Educator at the Hagen History Center. Our guest is Betsy MacKrell of the Erie Cemetery Association. Tonight's presentation is entitled Women of Note Interred at the Erie Cemetery. Before I turn it over to Betsy, just a few announcements from the Hagen History Center. We are currently closed to the public due to the pandemic, but we're working to complete new exhibits in our new exhibit building, as well as those in the Watson Courtesy Mansion and the Wood Morrison House on our West 6th Street campus. We plan to be open mid-July of this year. Our staff has created many blogs and videos that are available on our website at www.eriehistory.org, and we encourage you to check those out regularly. Betsy MacKrell is an Erie native, graduate of Villa Maria Academy. As a teenager, she developed an interest in genealogy and family history while helping her father research and create a family tree for a reunion. Over time, her interest has grown from individual family trees to the endless intertwining of families that form our community. After earning a BA in English Literature at the University of Notre Dame, she worked in advertising and marketing and PR for the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. She moved to the West Coast in 1992, where she continued in advertising and marketing and worked for Ziff Davis Publishing, SoftBank Expos, and later in custom publishing at Fluent Communications. In 2006, she returned to Erie, where she joined the Erie Cemetery as database manager and de facto history person. Love that. This position allows her to further her passion for genealogy. At the same time, she has tracked down information on numerous people, both well-known and obscure, who are buried in the Erie Cemetery Association's cemeteries. In 2011, she received the Spirit of 1812 Award by the Lake Erie chapter of the Daughters of 1812 for her work in locating and honoring the graves of unknown soldiers and sailors of the War of 1812 that are interred at the Erie Cemetery. Betsy?
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate that. Thank you for joining us for this talk about women of note interred in Erie Cemetery. It's going to be an unusual talk for me. I'm used to doing these talks with walking through the cemetery at the same time. I think if we did this one walking through the cemetery, I'd wear out your shoes before we were done, because we're going to be going back and forth if we were going as they're buried. Luckily, this is not that way. So let's kick it off. Erie Cemetery, if you're not familiar with our cemetery, was founded in 1850. It's part of the American Rural Cemetery movement. That movement was a change in how cemeteries are designed. In fact, it's a cemetery that is designed. Prior to that, cemeteries were usually affiliated with a church. Churchyard cemeteries tend not to be very pretty, or at least they weren't at the time. Managed by the churches themselves, they could be somewhat unpleasant, somewhat uneven, and somewhat double used in graves often. With the American Rural Cemetery movement, there was thought and conscious attention given to layout for attractiveness, park-like, pleasant trees, plantings, flowering shrubs, all to give you a really beautiful day out. Our first interment was in 1851. It was a man, a victim of smallpox, one of our corporators. Unfortunately, I don't think that he thought he was signing on for that when he put his money down to help buy the cemetery. Our first woman interment was a few days later. Her name was Jane Flavel Warren Standish, a young wife and mother. She died and was buried with her own parents and one of her children. Her husband moved on, moved west, remarried, had other children, but Jane was survived by just one son. But we were still in frontier days. Our first white woman settler, in fact, was Hannah Harwood Reed. You can sort of see the ghost of her on the left-hand side wearing an immense bonnet, and then her headstone is there on the right. She came to Erie in 1796 along with her husband and two of her sons. They were equipped with fairly little. She had a bedroll, she had a few utensils, she had some supplies. Among those supplies was a cask of whiskey. They were very careful to tell us. And I think that that was probably something that came in pretty darn handy. One of the first suggestions she made to her husband was that their first home become an inn. So they founded that as the Presque Isle Hotel. And one of their first visitors said that the house was provided with plenty of good refreshments for all itinerants who chose to call. She's buried in section C in lot 1, and in the cemetery, the Reed family lot is the only lot that is a section unto itself. They have a central column with a woman's figure at the top, and soon I'm hoping that we will have a drone video of that available on our website so that you can actually get a look at that lady up there, because everybody calls her various names. So you'll be able to get a look at her soon on our website. Our next one, very, very, very popular story. The War of 1812 flag makers. Everyone's familiar with Oliver Hazard Perry and the story of the Battle of Lake Erie. And many people know that the flag, the Don't Give Up the Ship flag, was made here in Erie. The women who made that flag, Margaret Forster Stewart, her sister, Dorcas Forster Bell, and Dorcas's daughters, Jane and Elizabeth, and their brothers' daughters, Elizabeth, Rachel, Mary, and Catherine, they worked together on the flag. It was truly a family affair. And these women, that would have been their brothers, their husbands, their father, all of them would have been fighting or building or going to sea with this effort. So they were all truly involved in the effort for the Battle of Lake Erie. Putting together the flag, they were asked to do that by Samuel Hamilton, the purser for Oliver Hazard Perry, in the summer of 1813, when the Perry's ship was over at Sandusky. He brought that up on deck the night of the battle and told them the story again of Lawrence dying and giving his last words. "My brave lads, the inscription on this flag is the last words of the gallant Captain Lawrence, after whom this ship is named. Don't give up the ship. Shall I hoist it?" And you know that their reply was, "Aye, aye, sir." And within short time, the battle was enjoined, and eventually Harry carried the day. That flag is now the property of Annapolis. It came back to Erie last in 1913 for the sesquicentennial. That is a picture of the flag itself on the right in its restored format. So I hope we can have it come back to Erie again, but I mean, I'm sure it's in such fragile state that it's not a traveling piece at this point in time. So Margaret Forster Stewart's in section E, 77. Dorcas is in A, 24. The daughters are not with us. They have scattered, as daughters do. So you can visit the others, though. Another early settler, Elizabeth Marvin Colt. Again, she was not born in Erie, but she came to Erie, is known for having hosted the ladies' reception for General Lafayette's visit here in 1825. If you remember your 5th grade history, American history, General Lafayette came back to Erie to make a triumphant visit to all the places that he helped when he helped George Washington win the Revolution. And he was feted everywhere along the way. And he was quite the gallant gentleman, and all the ladies liked to come out and meet General Lafayette. So Elizabeth Marvin Colt having a ladies' reception for him would have been a social triumph. Another thing she did was found the first Presbyterian church in Erie. And following a visit to Massachusetts, where she attended Sunday school there and was impressed by it, she enlisted a couple of other women, and they formed the first Sunday school services in Erie. First only for girls, but the girls' brothers requested to be involved as well. And they apparently had to consider this very hard, thinking the boys would be a rowdy and disruptive influence. Well, the boys were eventually admitted, and by 1822, there were 81 children in the class, nearly a quarter of whom were Black. If you look at Journey to Jerusalem, they refer to that as being probably underprivileged children, given that a quarter of them were Black. But I don't know. I mean, one attendee was Horace Greeley. It might have been just because this was a frontier town and because it was early, it might have just been an integrated group. So I'd love to learn more about that, but that's still early enough that it would have been burned up in the courthouse fire, so we won't find any proof. And Elizabeth Marvin Colt is in section D, lot 43. That's more or less across from the Scott Mausoleum. Calista Ingersoll Gara. Calista Ingersoll Gara, born in 1818, was a teacher and a free thinker who encouraged the development of the arts, music, and dance. Now, when I say free thinker, what was so free about her is she taught with her hair down, which was shocking. And she and her sister taught people the waltz, which was scandalous. This is very early, of course. That was shocking is now, well, times change. Later on, she became a temperance crusader. And I'm not sure if she participated in the temperance crusade that went through Wesleyville and smashed all the bars, but she definitely petitioned, along with the other 98 ladies of first standing, for laws that would prohibit liquor. Their quotes, "We are not politicians, nor do we ask for the right to vote. We petition those who hold in their hands the power to drive the demon of intemperance from among us." So important at that time because alcohol was everywhere. Alcohol was more safe than the drinking water, but alcohol was tearing up families apart. Women did not have rights. Women did not have rights to their children. And if alcohol is being used in the home is falling apart. So it would have been a strong force that would make the women come out to speak against alcohol in that way so early on. So, oh, also of note with Calista was that she married the publisher of one of the Erie papers, and she is buried in section S, lot 2. That's up on top of the hill overlooking the reservoir, right behind the War of 1812 unknowns. Now, next we have Mary A. Brooks Woods, doctor and healthcare practitioner, or doctor or healthcare practitioner, depending on how you want to think about it. She was born in Crawford County, the daughter of a farmer. She received a good education, as the materials say. She began teaching at age 15, which is similar to Laura Ingalls Wilder. In 1860, after she was married and had a couple children, she began to study medicine. 1861, she enrolled at the Western Homeopathic College in Cleveland, which she graduated from. Then that same year, her husband and she moved from Linesville to Erie, following his career, and she began to treat women's health issues. Now, I called her doctor / healthcare practitioner for two reasons. One, many people look upon homeopathy as questionable. I don't know whether they did in the 1800s, but also as a woman, they would have looked upon her as highly questionable at that time, even more so. However, she certainly built up a very strong practice treating women and children and continued to do so until her death. And her influence undoubtedly worked upon her son, who became a doctor and a surgeon. And his wife, her son's wife, was Dr. Adella Brindle Woods, who was so determined to receive an education that she rented a room in Erie so that she could attend the high school in Erie. So she ate cold food through the week, studied. I mean, this is not exactly, I want to go to prom. This is, I want an education. She graduated the Erie High School in 1869 with honors. That's the same class that Otto Jarecki was. And then she went to the University of Michigan, probably because it was the only place that would accept a woman, and interned at the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia. And this is all despite the social pressure she would have gotten for being unfeminine, unnatural, monstrous, or any of the other arguments against women working in a field that was considered indelicate. She returned to Erie and specialized again in the diseases of women and children, but she was also incredibly socially and civically active. She was the first practicing woman physician. She crusaded for clean drinking water. Typhoid plagued Erie for decades in the 1800s. For pasteurized milk, so that the milk being sold would be safe for all. For medical exams for school children, not accessible for the kids who were poor. She was a member of the Northwestern Pennsylvania Suffrage Association and served on their flood relief committee in 1915. That's something probably no one remembers or knows about the Suffrage Association. They stepped in after the Mill Creek flood to make sure that many people whose homes were swept away would have food, clothing, shelter in that terrible time when they didn't have any. She's also involved in the Erie County Medical Society, the Women's Club, and church and social clubs. She is interred in section 22, lot 62. Next, we come to Elizabeth Lovey Waters Burley Elmendorf. She's an African-American born in Lansing, Michigan, the daughter of Hamilton Waters and Lucinda Duncanson. Now, if you have spent any time on history in Erie, you've heard of Hamilton Waters, who was town crier, lamplighter, and also apparently involved himself in finding lost children and getting them back where they belonged. Elizabeth and her whole family found education to be of the highest importance. As you can see in the photo there, she is pictured with books, and apparently there's also cut out of the picture some musical symbols as well. She graduated in 1855 from the Pittsburgh Avery College. That was the first secondary school that had an African-American staff. So that, it was African-American students, African-American staff, and she delivered the salutatory address in both English and French. And I've included a quote describing from the newspaper. Mademoiselle Elizabeth Waters of Erie, Pennsylvania, delivered an address, La Salutation in French. Miss Waters is a very intelligent young lady in appearance, and her pronunciation of the French language was correct and indicated an excellent knowledge of the tongue. Now, this is where we get sad. She taught at Erie's Wesleyan Methodist Church School, known as the Colored School. No roles commensurate with her experience in education were open to her in Erie's white schools, although she did work there as a janitor, which had to have broken her heart in many ways. Moving to the future, she had two daughters, however, who did teach in Erie public schools. Eva Grace Burley, who was born in 1870, and Bess Duncanson Elmendorf Marshall, both taught in Erie's public schools, not for incredibly long. Eva Grace left Erie. She also taught in Virginia and then went to New York City, where she was involved not only in teaching, but also in a lot of civic and social justice movements there. In fact, she even worked and volunteered with W.E.B. Du Bois, very impressive. And then Bess Duncanson taught for a short while, and then she resigned early in 1905, and I believe she married and then she passed away that same year. Now, shameless promotion here. If you look carefully at this page, Elizabeth Elmendorf, Henry Burley, and I put the star on the wrong person there, Henry Burley, Eva Grace, Ada Sampson, the infant Burley, Bess Duncanson Elmendorf Marshall are all buried in a four-grave plot in section 37S without markers. There are also one or two other people in there, Hamilton Waters, for instance. It is my hope that someday we will all become organized enough somehow to get some markers on this family, because they are of historical note beyond all measure. So that's my plug for the moment. Next, we'll move to Laura Goodwin Sanford. She's the daughter of Giles Sanford, who was a successful Erie businessman. And in 1861, she wrote the first history of the settling of Erie, and she used original documents and recollections of people living during the period. She was a founding member of the Home for the Friendless, along with about 30 other people, and a member and first president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874. She was a member of a great many of the clubs that were prevalent at the time and participated in many of their activities. And I didn't recount them all here because they will appear on many other of these slides with a point. So Laura Sanford, her history was cited by numerous people who wrote later histories of Erie as well. And they consulted her when they were writing them. Definitely first source material for Erie. Emma Gertrude Toll Lawrence, the first Black woman business owner in Erie, came here in 1881 and suffered the loss of her husband in 1889, leaving her to bring up 4 children. To do so, she opened a laundry. And in 1906, well, I'm sorry, she did so by taking in washing and then opened a laundry in 1906. The Lawrence Cleaning and Dyeing Company, which stayed open for decades. She was actively involved in civic organizations, the Red Cross, the Young Women's Christian Association. She served as a national deputy commander for the Army and Navy Union and a sectional president of the Needlework Guild. Now, we're going to talk about the Needlework Guild for a moment, because that is not people embroidering pillows. The Needlework Guild produced clothes. The Needlework Guild produced blankets. The Needlework Guild supported efforts to clothe the poor, warm the cold. They were impressive. In one of the World War I era newspapers, I found a clipping through Linda Bola, actually, who sent it my way. Needlework Guild collects 7,451 garments. That's local. That isn't national. It's just amazing to me that what we have as a local club, they stepped in and filled a need that vast in very little time. It's something we'll see again and again when we look at the clubs that were existent in Erie at the time. Emma Gertrude was interred in section 5 singles, row O, grave 53. And before we go on, if you'll see just above her headstone, there is a flag, a Pennsylvania keystone with the 6 stars there. She is considered a suffragist, although she was not an active suffragist, because although she was not a member of the Northwestern Pennsylvania suffrage movement, she would have been in spirit, but most of our suffragists were wealthy women of privilege who had the time to devote to that organization. But the ideals of the group were ones dear to her heart and to several other women who were probably unable to accord the time to the interests of the suffragist movement. Moving on, Ada Louise Lawrence, granddaughter of Emma Gertrude Toll Lawrence. She was an inspirational educator in the Erie School District for 36 years and considered to be the first Black full-time teacher in the Erie School District. I know that we have in Journey to Jerusalem and other places, like newspaper accounts I've found, other teachers who were assigned classrooms in the Erie Public Schools who might have been the first. Given that Ada Louise Lawrence had a 36-year career, that's a longer length than any of the others had achieved. So I consider that to be pretty impressive right there. She's a graduate of Cheney State Teachers College. She was interred in 2014 in Section N, Lot 87, Grave 1. I remember the day her funeral happened. Lovely lady. Sarah Reed. Sarah Reed, one of our most famous occupants of the cemetery, definitely a suffragist, definitely a DAR member. She worked with 30 other women to found the Home for the Friendless in 1871, which took two marginalized groups in the city, elderly women and children, and gave them a place to live, gave them entertainment, gave them education, and it still stands today in two different organizations, a retirement center and a children's center. Sarah Reed authored books for children and adults, and if any of you have access to those, please let me know if I could read them. I would love to. She was a member of the suffragist organization, the Northwest Pennsylvania Suffrage Association, and on their advisory board, and was again actively involved in the Erie Art Club, the Young Women's Christian Association, the Presque Isle chapter of the DAR, and other clubs. She was interred in Section A, Lot 8, and you can see her headstone there, very bright and clean. That is right near the front of the cemetery, easily located, and facing, I believe, Section C. Now, we don't have a photo of Augusta Brown Fleming. She is a suffragist. We do have a card she appeared on where she is, I believe, standing on a soapbox, asking for votes for women. That's her signature on the right face of the soapbox. And she is saying that home is not only the cubic space between garret and cellar, but wherever the child goes. She was president of the Erie Women's Suffrage Association and led the very first march for women's suffrage in Pennsylvania, not just Erie, on July 8th, 1913, which kicked off from her own front door. In 1920, she was the founding president of the Erie League of Women Voters and worked to register women to exercise their new right to vote in the 1920 presidential election. She served as president of the Erie County Council of Republican Women and vice president of the Pennsylvania organization overall, and was a delegate to 3 Republican national conventions. When she passed away, she was interred in Section D, Lot 11. She's followed by Carrie Tracy Watson. Carrie Tracy Watson is most known for her work in civic beautification, particularly through gardening, but that's not just raising flowers. She was also a leader in the Women's Land Army during World War I, which supported the interests of soldiers and those on the home front, for instance, home defense gardens. And she founded the first garden club in Erie, now named in her honor, the Carrie T. Watson Garden Club. And she also worked in other civic organizations, the YWCA, and supporting their efforts to assist training camps in World War I, working with immigrant populations. She was in World War I meeting up with a group of YWCA people who were discussing their $4 million raised in support of those efforts. That's not exactly just getting together at the Y to go swimming. It's impressive. When she passed, she was interred in Section 3, Lot 45. Another, again, this is a suffragist, and these are, if you're noticing a theme, it's because many of these women from this era fully believed that for women to take their rightful part in society as we move forward was that they needed to vote. They needed a full franchise in our society. Mary Richards Dupuy Spencer was a suffragist and again a member of the Suffrage Association and a founding member of the League of Women Voters. And this one worked very hard on flood relief during the Mill Creek flood period. Vice President of the Vice President of the Home for the Friendless, member of the Needlework Guild, the Women's Club, the DAR, and the Carrie T. Watson Garden Club. She's buried at the top of the hill in Section 12. Helen Margaret Stone Schler, this is not easy for me to say, Schleroff, worked as a suffragist, and she was Mrs. Republican. This one's fun. She was the first Pennsylvania woman-elect county commissioner. She served for 3 4-year terms from 1932 to 1944, and her chief claim to fame was as Mrs. Republican. She held a seat on the Republican State Committee from 1919 to 1931. Something I find sort of incongruous here was that all of these ladies were members of the League of Women Voters, which in recent years has been very much it hasn't been both Democrat and Republican. It's been more Democrat. And many of these women are Democrat or Republican. So I'm encouraged. I think that the League of Women Voters is and ought to be very much even-handed, because all women vote. We all need that. And at any rate, Helen Margaret Stone Schleroff is in section 21, lot 88. And as you can see, we got that picture on a very snowy day. So Jane Weir Presley is also at the top of the hill. Jane was again a suffragist. She believed once the voting rights were achieved, she again went for the League of Women Voters and stayed on there as an active member until her death. She served on the hygiene board, spearheading efforts to keep everyone clean everywhere, and began a family day school for the underprivileged children of working mothers. She served on the board of directors of the YWCA. The lot she's buried on, if you're familiar with the cemetery, it's at the top of the hill, and the center monument looks like a broken column. I've had people say it was struck by lightning, but it is not. It was not. It was ordered that way. It is a symbol of a life unfinished, of someone who passed before they were done with their work. That was not Jane. She clearly lived quite a few years. It was one of the men in her family. Next, we have Louisa Card Catlin. She studied art in New York City and taught art in Erie, although she believed that art can't be taught. She taught the students the principles of art, the skills, and encouraged them to develop those skills to achieve realism with the tools they had at hand. Later, she left Erie to pursue her art skills in Paris. When she returned, she married Henry Catlin and again resumed teaching. She organized the Erie Art Club in 1898. And then in 1904, she purchased one of the most famous paintings we have in Erie, which hangs in the Blasco Library. And there it is, Sunday Afternoon, Isle of Shoals. There. Now, she is interred in Erie Cemetery, and I didn't put down the location. Shame on me. Okay. Next, we have Carrie Williams Lawson, who was written about in her obituary as Erie's most active Negro worker. Charter member of the Mothers of Democracy, with a husband and 4 sons serving in World War I, and a charter member of the Estelle B. Jordan Army and Navy Union. She was active at the St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church. She was frequently a soloist singing soprano, and a strong supporter of the Black Girl Scouts, and supervised the Scouts through the end of her life. She's in 29 singles, row B, grave 15. The headstone on her, this is a little odd, the headstone on her grave differs, both on birth and death, but it is, however, we're going with the obituary rather than the headstone, because the obituary was most likely the correct one. So, Catherine Hayes Law Wright, a final doctor for us, was born in Erie but raised in Lowell, Massachusetts. She graduated from the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia in 1904 and pursued extended training at Massachusetts General. When she came back to Erie in 1909, she focused on public health. She was very active fighting the Spanish flu, and then took over the TB clinic at 21st and Peach in the same year. Her actions led her to be elected the president of Erie County Medical Society in 1920. and continued fighting for free chest x-rays for all adults to combat the rapid spread of TB. She's interred in Section 5, Lot 117. That is the last slide. I have a couple of thoughts. I'm sure you noticed that there are a couple things here. None of the women who are in here were first movers into the frontier that Erie was. That role went to the men and their families. They took the frontier and pushed it to be livable and then comfortable, whether it was with a cask of whiskey in a hotel or by bringing in church. They civilized it with church, school, and morality, and fought to improve it with health, sanitation, and living conditions. And then moving toward the 20th century, they looked toward equality and to achieving the vote. The second thing that occurred to me was clubs. Notice the proliferation of clubs that the women belonged to. It wasn't simply the women, men belonged to clubs as well. The clubs filled in the gap that we now turn to with government. We expect the government to fill in all those gaps where, back then people turned to each other and they got the job done. They didn't have clubs for home decor or learning millinery. They had clubs to do good. The women who joined them many of them were at this level, they were women of wealth and privilege. They had the time to devote to causes since their food, clothing, and shelter was seen to. And they didn't have an obligation to do this, but truly saw it as their duty, the price they paid for their privilege. But if you scratch a little further down the social scale, many of the same clubs are active lower down, just at a different level. People felt it was their duty to contribute toward everyone's comfortability, everyone's support. And I don't know that we do that as much anymore these days, and I'm not sure whether we are better off or worse off because of it. And I guess it's something I'd want to think about more. I thank you for your time and attention this evening. If you have any questions.
Betsy, thank you for such a wonderful talk. I mean, I'm struck by a few things. When I was teaching high school, I would find in the textbooks the comment at the end of every chapter, women during, I'll pick a period, women during the Civil War, African Americans during the Civil War, immigrants during the Civil War. And it's important that we think of women being involved side by side with the men. They're not an afterthought. And I think that those books that were, somewhat dated, surprised to find out many school students don't have textbooks anymore. Another thing that has always struck me, and your talk backs this up, is the different movements that women were involved in before they had the right to vote. I suppose we begin with the abolition movement. Women were very prominent in the abolition movement, trying to end slavery. And then the temperance movement. And to some extent, the temperance movement and the abolition movement go hand in hand, coming kind of at the same time. But the temperance movement continues on after the abolition of slavery. And then the suffrage movement, where women struggle and realize that it's time for them to get the right to vote. And I wondered, I've been through the cemetery when the markers were there, the purple and gold markers for the suffragettes. Are they still there?
They are indeed. They are.
Good.
They will remain there. In fact, I believe the program will expand, not necessarily in my cemetery this year, but it will expand through other cemeteries in Pennsylvania.
That's fantastic. You mentioned Linda Bola, and Linda had a role in that?
Linda developed a fantastic walking tour through Erie Cemetery for suffragists.
Good, good. I've got a lot of people commenting. Sarah says that a lot of people have commented on how informative and enjoyable it was.
Well, thank you very much.
I have to mention and throw a plug our way too. You talked about Carrie Watson. She is, of course, the wife of Harrison Watson, the Watson in the Watson Curtsey Mansion, our home. Yes, so would be remiss if I didn't mention her. Once again, we have no questions coming in via Facebook. I just want to tell you what a fantastic talk it was, and I look forward to coming to the cemetery once the weather breaks and having you take me around. I really do.
Definitely.
I'd like to thank our speaker tonight, Betsy MacKrell and Sarah Little, our tech support, and all of you who watched online. Thank you very much, Betsy and Sarah, and good night, everyone. Take care.
Okay.